how's it going?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me once again for Trad Queen Story Hour. Tonight, I am joined by the inestimable Greg Price. He is a purveyor of all real news, and he is a good collector of a lot of these big and breaking stories. Greg, what have you been up to? What are you excited about?
It's great to be an honorary Trad Queen tonight with you, Lydia.
That's
Great
right.
to be on. I started working about a month and a half ago with the State Freedom Caucus Network, and basically what we're doing is we're taking the House Freedom Caucus that everybody knows and loves, the actual fighters in Congress, not just against the left, but of the rot in the Republican Party as well. And we're bringing it into state capitals all over America, because swamps don't just exist in Washington, D.C. They exist in 50 state capitals and 50 states too. And, the media attention tends to, focus on what comes out of Washington. But the reality is what's coming out of your state capital impacts your life in a much greater way than what comes out of D.C. on a daily basis. And a lot of the problems that we like to complain about the GOP nationally are also exist in the states, but on a much worse scale. There's a lot of liberals pretending to be conservatives in your state capitals, voting to take your rights away every single day, and we're simply not paying attention to it. That's what we can get into specifics about that, but that's what we're looking to try to fix by, equipping state legislatures with the resources and the tools to be an effective body to push back against the GOP establishment in their states that is not representing conservative voters the way that they should, as well as getting conservatives to pay attention to this stuff in much of the same way that we've started paying attention to school boards finally over the last 3 years.
That's great. I'm really happy to hear that. So when I was down closer to DC when we were in Maryland, I remember reading and hearing about West Virginia and all the various ways that they were being blindsided by, for example, some of these school board members who were moving in and being extremely leftist. People in West Virginia did not expect that because West Virginia is a super conservative state. In the same way, I believe in West Virginia, they had this ruling on, biological males competing in female sports. And I think that correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm sure you're much more informed about this than I am, but I think that one went to the Supreme Court and was struck down. I'm not sure, not entirely sure about that one, but do you know
I don't think it was
one?
struck down yet. I think
Okay.
they're allowing it to be enforced pending an official review. I'm not
Okay.
don't hold me to that. I'm not
Yeah,
100% sure.
I'm not sure either.
But
But
the
yeah,
Title IX stuff just came out though, which is fully crazy that they're fully not going to let states and schools protect women's sports. And they're weaponizing Title IX, which was designed to protect women's in sports and ensure fairness in women's sports. And now they're weaponizing it to ensure that men can play women's sports. It's crazy.
It is crazy. And it is interesting to watch, too, the way these things they put into place, they then will twist to their own ends as the landscape changes slightly. So we've moved from trying to protect females, like biological females. We've kind of moved on into a new form of feminism because we no longer actually, care about the effects that this might have on biological women. We only care about, again, virtue signaling, the maximum amount of virtue to the maximum amount of tolerance and acceptance, or whatever they're saying it is now. And it's going to harm women in the long run, but they don't care because the overarching ideology and this pushing this message is much more important than actually protecting people, which is sad to see, but not really surprising, unfortunately. So we see that from the Biden administration. What else are we seeing from the Biden administration that's troubling to you, especially specifically right now?
I mean, what is
What's
there
not?
to talk about?
Yeah.
What isn't problematic and concerning about? I mean, I just think the biggest one is just the push to World War III, and the fact that our government is fully controlled by absolute maniac, bloodthirsty neocons. People talk about all the time about how Gen Z went overwhelmingly for Democrats in 2020 and 2022, and I think the biggest way that you could kind of push back on that and actually reach out to them saying voting for Donald Trump over Joe Biden will give you there will be a very much a less chance that you are now conscripted to fight in World War III if you vote for Donald Trump over Joe Biden. It's true. With the whole war in Ukraine, it's the same thing that we've been doing for the last 2 decades in the Middle East, where they're just endlessly funding a proxy war against Russia. And we know from the leaks now from this Discord bro, which is really funny, by the way, that our U.S. Special Forces are on the ground, and God only knows what they're doing, but U.S. Special Forces are on the ground in Ukraine, being stationed at America's embassy. And they have there's nobody in the government between Democrats and more establishment Republicans has any plan to end our involvement. They have no plan to, maybe negotiate a peace where both sides have things that they hate about it, but it ends the fighting. They don't want to do that. Instead, they just want to keep funding war until apparently the end of time, however long it takes. God only knows how that is. And they think this is a game. It's not a game. Russia and America are the two most nuclear armed countries in the world. And they're pushing, they're actively escalating tensions between the two countries using Ukraine as a proxy. As obviously we feed billions and billions of our tax dollars there, and it makes it more likely that there will be another devastating conflict. And so, vote for Republicans in 2024 if you don't, or specifically, specifically what the media considers to be far-right Republicans, who are the only people in D.C. today that are actively fighting back against the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me to think about the number of actual anti-war Republicans. I think I can count them on two fingers. I think there's only two people in there. I think it's Thomas Massie and Rand Paul. And as far as I can tell, those are the biggest two names of people who are actively speaking out against this kind of involvement. And it's not just because they're more libertarian. It's because they can see the negative ramifications of this kind of ongoing conflict, like we saw in Afghanistan after that ridiculous withdrawal that we had. The whole 20 years or whatever it was we spent in Afghanistan was problematic enough. That was enough of a money sink for the US. It was enough of just a total waste of time. But the withdrawal was just the cherry on top. It was, oh my gosh, it made everything worse. I don't want to rant about that. So I want to ask you instead, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and ask you what you think about the leaker, because that's something I haven't discussed very much. I found it interesting, haven't fully formed my own opinion yet.
Oh, well, the whole story is hilarious and also incredibly concerning. It's concerning in the fact that his leaks showed that the government the government is lying about the war in Ukraine. It's shocking. I know they're lying about, Ukraine's ability to, defend itself and actually win. They're lying about U.S. troops not being on the ground. And that's what these leaks showed. It's funny in the sense that, this guy, these leaks came on a Discord server where this guy was just this 21-year-old air guardsman who apparently had a high security clearance was just arguing with his boys on Discord and was about the war in Ukraine. He's like, no, actually, I work in the government and you're wrong about this. Well, here's my evidence.
Right.
And then this gets leaked, all over the internet, obviously. And it's, we've had all these hearings about TikTok and stuff lately, being worried about foreign powers having access to sensitive data of Americans. And meanwhile, they can't even prevent these leaks happening from just a random 21-year-old on Discord. It's funny, but I guess good on him because he revealed that the government is lying.
Yeah, not shocking to anyone, but it's been interesting to watch how the media treats him, because I don't know if you'll recall, but there have been other leakers that came out under Republican presidencies, under Republican administrations, and they were treated like complete pariahs, or no, they were treated as saints, right? Because they were blowing the whistle on a Republican-led government. Now this guy is coming out and saying this is happening under the Biden administration, and the mainstream media is up in arms about this. They will not talk about the content of the leaks, which is, you're welcome to disagree with me. You work more in that industry than I do, but I personally think that they should be taking issue with what's in the leaks rather than the method the leaker used to communicate it. What do you think? Because there's so much in there that proves the government was lying.
Well, yeah, you're 100% correct, but corporate media do not report the facts. They are subsidiaries of the federal government and of the intelligence agencies and of the deep state. They will never focus on things that embarrass the establishment of this country, because corporate media functions as an extension of them. And that's why after this leak happened, what you saw was not, the New York Times and Washington Post talking about, hey, the government is actually lying about the war in Ukraine. Instead, they immediately mobilized to track down the leaker and get him arrested, which is what the New York Times did before even the FBI got to him. Like,
Right.
it's amazing how leakers are treated when they're this guy who embarrassed the military-industrial complex. They immediately mobilized to find him right away versus, other leakers such as the Trump Ukraine whistleblower who were, treated as heroes. Now, again, the situations are very different, but still, like, when the Ukraine whistleblower came out during the first Trump impeachment, you weren't even allowed to say his name.
Right.
Like,
I remember that.
I remember being at the Daily Caller at the time, and like we got shit on by people for saying the name of the whistleblower in copy by all these corporate outlets. And then meanwhile, they literally are like working hand in glove with the FBI to track down this guy who was talking who leaked things on Discord about, about how the government was lying. Like, it's amazing to see the difference, but this happens for every person like that. Like, you can go back to Edward Snowden, who is now in exile in Russia from his own country after exposing how governments were spying on people. Julian Assange is sitting in jail awaiting an apparent extradition to America, where he will probably die in custody over the fact that he exposed war crimes being committed by the U.S. Army in Iraq and Afghanistan. You have people like Daniel Hale currently sitting in jail because he exposed that Obama and John Brennan were lying about drone warfare in the Middle East. All of these people are sitting in jail, and people like Alexander Vindman go on MSNBC.
Yeah, that guy's not my favorite. Well, we also have like Chelsea Manning, who was considered basically fully absolved of their sins because they played the ultimate card of switching genders, and then they were like, suddenly they're a victim and they're no longer, guilty of any kind of leakage. Now, that was really interesting to me. And it's interesting that you remind me of our friend who leaked about Ukraine during the impeachment, because Rand Paul's feed got cut on YouTube because he mentioned his name. I remember my mind was so blown by that. I was like, this man is a sitting politician and he has every right to talk about this in an official capacity, and they still are choosing to censor him because they cannot have this person's name mentioned. And it was interesting. I don't know if you recall, this person actually had connections to all kinds of crazy stuff that nobody had considered. And of course, no one in the mainstream media looked into it because they had a vested interest in making it look like he was telling the truth and was completely, he had no strings attached at all. He was a completely innocent party, and he was in no way invested in Trump's impeachment. Of course, that was not true. They were unwilling to cover it. They were interested in changing history. That was a fantastic segue. I really want to talk to you about this thread that you did about AP history books, because AP history has been a topic of controversy, especially in Florida, because Ron DeSantis got rid of this one African American Studies AP course. And that, I think, has drawn a lot of attention to this whole AP idea. So what did you find? You said you wrote a Substack piece about it, which is awesome. We'll put a link to your Substack in the description of this video. You're talking about AP USH textbooks that are covering the Trump presidency. Ooh, what did you find?
I found a lot of bias, like a lot of what you would expect for textbooks being written by, college history professors. But some of it, like it basically the bias came in a couple forms. Now, one, when they were covering Russia meddling in the 2016 election, they basically were like, Russia meddled. They were doing things on social media that disrupted the electorate. They were, they hacked the DNC, gave it to WikiLeaks, et cetera, et cetera. They completely ignored the fact that studies later came out showing the very minimal impact Russian activities on social media actually had on the election. Not that it didn't happen, but the minimal impact that it had. And at the same time, they talked about that while completely ignoring stories like the Steele dossier. Not one of these 5 textbooks I went through mentioned the fact that Hillary Clinton's campaign paid a British MI6 agent who used a Russian source to dig up dirt on Donald Trump and accuse him of all of these things that turned out to be wrong. Not a single textbook mentioned that. Not a single textbook mentioned the abuses to the FISA system that were committed by the FBI in 2016 that led to them spying on Donald Trump. And pretty much all of these textbooks were published in like 2018, 2019, when the Steele dossier was public info, when the Nunez memo had came out that originally exposed the spying on Donald Trump's campaign. All of that stuff was out there, and they chose not to include that in the story and just said that, hey, Russia meddled, et cetera, Donald Trump got elected because of Russia. In addition to that, a lot of these books contain like all of this anti-Trump editorializing that any unbiased person would not include in what is supposed to be an objective textbook. And so as an example, Eric Foner wrote one of these textbooks, who's a so-called respected historian from Columbia University. And he wrote about how in the book, like verbatim, that Donald Trump's campaign, resonated with people who wished for a time when women and people of color knew their place. He literally wrote that. He also suggested it was racist for Donald Trump to tweet that LeBron James and Maxine Waters lacked in intelligence. That is another thing that he wrote. Another one of these books said that Trump's victory in 2016 was because of, quote, angry white men. That was another one. And the biggest one that I found is the fact that in the American Pageant, which is the most popularly used APUSH textbook, they describe Donald Trump as, quote, a sexual predator. Now, they don't actually talk about the women who came out with allegations against Donald Trump. One that comes to mind is the lady who would then go on CNN and say rape is sexy. They don't mention how Donald Trump had been like a public figure for decades and decades, and he was only accused when he was running for president. But then if you go back to their coverage of Bill Clinton, they don't even talk about that. In this same book, The American Pageant, they describe him simply as, quote, dogged by scandal. Whereas Donald Trump is a sexual predator, and they obviously don't mention Paula Jones or Juanita Broaddrick or Catherine Wiley. And then finally, some of these books just contain things that are straight up lies, things that are just not even remotely true. And so one book, The American Promise, which was written by 7 authors, all of whom are college history professors, says that Donald Trump refused to condemn Charlottesville, which is a complete lie. He condemned it on the day it happened and several times after that. There's another one that has the Fine People hoax, obviously, which we know to be a lie today. There's one that covers COVID and into the beginning of the Biden advent that says that the most likely source of the virus was a wet market without mentioning the lab leak theory. There's another one in that same book also talks about January 6th and talks about Brian Sicknick being killed without specifying that he died the next day of a stroke. And so these are things that are just straight up lies. And the last thing I'll say about this that all of these textbooks do is they all cover Ferguson and the Michael Brown shooting, and none of them say that he robbed a convenience store, tried to steal Darren Wilson's gun, charged at him, and that Eric Holder's DOJ found hands up, don't shoot is a lie. That is all in these textbooks that are used in AP US history classes for high school students. And if these are what's in the textbooks, imagine what the teachers are saying. It's like, this is the history that is being written about the Trump administration that contains straight up lies and leaves out very important stories that were damaging to the liberal media's narrative.
That's fascinating. So how did this change what you think of the history we know today?
Well, I mean, obviously, because I have freed my mind from the shackles of corporate media and the shackles of the establishment in this country, I understand American history as it comes to Donald Trump, probably a lot better than a college history professor does. And so it didn't really change anything about what I view of history. What it did is it really opens your eyes to the people that are writing the history. And Donald Trump isn't even you don't even have to talk about Donald Trump about this. If you look at the historians' list of, of what they consider to be the greatest presidents in American history, it's like a joke. They have for example, they have Woodrow Wilson is constantly in the top 15 for greatest presidents ever. Woodrow Wilson, who resegregated the military, was an avowed racist, streamed that Ku Klux Klan movie at the White House, and, he was an overall terrible person, but is included in the top 15 of presidents ever because he was a liberal, because he was basically what we would consider a socialist to be today. You look at things like that, these people who are in charge of writing the history do not understand the history. And now the question becomes, how do we, as people who understand history in a proper way, fight back against this? And I think, we need to do that. We especially with what Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida by taking on the College Board in these AP classes when they're feeding garbage to students. That's what Republicans need to do.
Yeah, I think you're entirely correct. Well, that was going to be my next question, which was how do we counter this? Because it clearly needs to be countered. Is homeschooling the only option, or is there something else we could do to kind of tweak the way that this is taught? Do we need to get back into institutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of both. I think obviously homeschooling has been on the rise ever since the pandemic for a reason when parents finally learned the crap that their kids were being subjected to in schools. But, we can't just, we can't just do that as you said. We have to like fight back against this false depiction of history and everything and everything else in schools. I think, Republican politicians need to be doing this. I think they're winning issues. They're obviously winning issues. We obviously fight back for curriculum transparency is a big one. That's something at least Republicans on the states should be doing. It's a big issue that we talk about, that our Freedom Caucus members talk about, and pass laws that say, hey, if parents object to what is being taught, they have the ability to challenge it and take it out of the curriculum. Like these are common sense things that are spinned by liberals to say, oh, you're banning books and whatever. No, we are allowing parents to have a major say over what their children are learning. It has to be done. That's the only way. That's the biggest way we can do this. And that's what all Republican politicians need to be talking about.
Completely agree. So one of the biggest places we're seeing this is, again, in Florida, where they're saying there's a bill. I'm sure you're familiar. I'm sure you talked about it pretty much ad nauseum when it was a big deal, was the Don't Say Gay bill. Well, the actual title of this bill, I'm sure you know, involves parents and transparency of schools and curriculum accountability. Nothing to do with not saying any certain words in the classroom. The whole point was that parents would have more of a say in what happened in their child's teaching. And that was how the mainstream media spun it. So yeah, it doesn't really surprise me that the media is having such an outsized effect on history books, which is so interesting then to reflect back on the rest of history as we know it right now. First of all, I personally don't believe history is taught in any correct capacity in our modern education system. But when, as Jack Posobiec mentioned, because he retweeted you and he said, history is written by the winners. And I think he's entirely correct. They think they won, and maybe they did because they control all the institutions. I like your solutions, the ideas of like getting involved at the state level, trying to push for Florida style accountability for this kind of curriculum. Is there a place there also for school choice? Do you think that would be really, really helpful in this context or less helpful?
Well, no, there should be universal school choice in every red state. It's one of the most, school choice is like the most popular issue that Republicans could possibly run on. It is like polls show now that majorities of Democrats support school choice at this point. As it turns out, parents, no matter if they're Democrats or Republicans, enjoy being able to choose the education that they want for their students, as opposed to what Democrats want, which are to trap kids into a lifetime of failed public education where a zip code decides their future. Like the only reason that Democrats don't support school choice is because they are bought and paid for by the most powerful teachers unions in America, who don't want to have to compete, who don't want public schools that are failing to have to compete with private and charter schools that might be better options for parents. That's the only reason that there is not school choice everywhere in America, is because of how powerful of a political force teachers unions are. And so, yes, there should be school choice everywhere. And there's not in red states because of how terrible Republican leadership is. I know one of the big things that we were doing with our Freedom Caucuses was in Wyoming. And when you think Wyoming, you think that's probably the most conservative state in America. Well, the Speaker of the House in Wyoming, Albert Summers, blocked a universal school choice bill from coming up for a vote that was supported not just by the Freedom Caucus, but by a majority of the entire caucus in Wyoming. And he blocked that. If you go to Georgia, Georgia just tried to pass a universal school choice bill, and 16 Republicans in the state Senate voted against it, and it ended up failing. Like, that is a joke. That should never happen in any red state. And, that's why the work we're doing to build freedom caucuses in places like Georgia and Wyoming is so important, because these places, like the Republicans here, are terrible. And we simply do not pay attention to it. People probably assume that because their state rep and state senator has an R next to their name, that they are governing in a way that reflects the conservative voters that elect them. But it's not true. It's a systemic problem everywhere. And, the school choice thing was a perfect example of it.
Yeah, it is interesting, the school choice thing, because I follow Azra Nomani, which everybody should, and she is constantly talking about how serious parents across the spectrum are about having options for their children, because she's over in Virginia and she's talking about a school that denied, I believe it was, her son access to a scholarship literally based on how meritorious his work was and the fact that he was not the appropriate minority. Now, I believe her family is from Pakistan. I don't want to get that wrong, but she is from a Middle Eastern state. But her son wasn't African American. He was considered Asian. So they were quick to say, no, we're not going to give him the benefit of the doubt. He doesn't get access to this scholarship. Insanely racist, insanely biased. And she's constantly battling people all over the political spectrum over there. It strikes me that people take the easy way out when it comes to the people who have an R by their name. And they just assume these people are going to fight for the rights that they pretended they would in order to get elected. Now, you keep mentioning these freedom caucuses on a state-by-state basis. How are those going to help fix this problem? Does that bring more accountability?
Yeah, it brings more accountability, and it also pushes the terrible GOP leaders to actually govern in ways that are reflective of the conservative voters in these states. And I gave you a couple examples before. I'll give you a couple more of how deep the problem goes. So if you look at the voting records of Republicans in state legislatures all over America, the Republicans with the most liberal voting records are in Hawaii. Right? That makes sense, right? Hawaii, there's probably only like 10 Republicans in the whole state. Do you know what? Take a guess at what second is. Do you know what who are the second most liberal Republican lawmakers in terms of their voting record in a state legislature?
I'm going to say Virginia.
No, Virginia's actually at the top. The answer is South Carolina.
Really?
South Carolina. Now, you think of South Carolina, you think, that's a very red state. Republicans have super majorities in all of the houses of the legislature. There's a Republican governor. But no, if you look at their voting records, Democrats may as well have a majority. And so our Freedom Caucus in South Carolina has been one of the most successful out of all of them in pushing back against, the terrible Republicans in their legislature. And in 2022, conservatives who then joined the Freedom Caucus unseated 5 Republican incumbents in the 2022 South Carolina primary. That is a lot. And so when this session of the legislature started, the GOP leadership tried to get every Republican member to sign this quote, what the Freedom Caucus called a loyalty oath. And basically what this said is you're not allowed to campaign against any Republicans. You're not allowed to criticize on social media any Republicans. You're not allowed to the biggest reason they were mad at the Freedom Caucus was you're not allowed to tweet pictures of the vote board when votes happen. And they refused to sign it. And what happened was the House GOP leadership kicked our Freedom Caucus out of the Republican caucus. That's how bad it is. Like, imagine if, when the speaker fight was happening in Congress, imagine if McCarthy had kicked the 20 members out of the caucus entirely. That would have been insane. That literally happened in South Carolina when, for the first time in many, many years, Republican conservative legislatures actually pushed back against Republican leaders. And just to give you a couple examples of terrible things that they passed, they just voted to give massive taxpayer buyouts and government contracts to Volkswagen and Scout Motors, electric vehicles companies, to come to South Carolina, which are, by the way, Scout Motors is also like an insanely woke corporation that donates to left-wing causes, and they now have a massive contract being funded by South Carolina taxpayers. That's something that just happened. You can go down the list. They recently tried to, the Freedom Caucus tried to put forward an amendment to defund the DEI departments at all of South Carolina's colleges and universities, and a majority of Republicans voted against it. Like, it's really bad. And like, if you look at going back to talking about like the bad voting records, Alabama, Utah, and Mississippi are all right above South Carolina in most liberal categories. Florida and Virginia are actually at the top. Florida is at the very top. But all of these states that you think are very red, like they will never vote for Democrats statewide in their entire life, have all of these liberals pretending to be conservatives running as Republicans, getting elected, and governing as if they're Democrats. It's a real problem, and the Freedom Caucus is going to fix it.
That's fantastic. I love that you guys are actually looking at the policies they're dealing with, because for some, it seems like for way too many conservatives, it's just good enough that Republicans win a seat. But it's not. And it hasn't been that way for a long time, but it seems like nobody's really been paying attention to it. I'm so glad you guys are drawing people's attention to this. And hopefully you guys are able to tell people when it comes to voting for these candidates to make sure that the people they're voting for are actually going to deliver what they say they are, and to make sure that those people are promising what is in line with the voters' values. So that strikes me as a hugely positive thing. Now, what state? So you said that they had a lot of pushback in South Carolina. Oh my gosh, I can't talk. Sorry. You said they had a lot of pushback in South Carolina. What state have they done the best in? Where have you seen the biggest results?
South Carolina would definitely, I think, is near the top. I think Wyoming has done a great job too. Our Montana caucus has been really good. Our South Dakota caucus has been doing really well. I would say those four have done, I think, the best of what we tell them to do, of what we tell them to do, of how to be a successful Freedom Caucus. Like the South Dakota legislature just passed a bill that would essentially put the state on a path to CBDCs, central bank digital currencies.
Right.
Basically, this bill said that the only currencies that are considered legitimate are ones that governments approve of. And so if this bill became law, if the federal government ever said that, hey, we now have a CBDC, that would apply to South Dakota. And our Freedom Caucus fought against it. It successfully got Governor Gnome to veto it. Also, our Arizona caucus is full of really good people. They do a really good job. They're at the top as well. All of these caucuses do really good things on a daily basis. The biggest thing is just, for the first time ever, standing up to GOP leaders in a way that no members of their bodies have done before. Being loud about it, voting together, obviously proposing conservative policies. Like, all of these things are what go into making a good Freedom Caucus, and they're making waves in major ways.
That's fantastic. That really is a white pill for sure. And I'm really glad that you are kind of spearheading this and helping make it happen. So Did you put the organization together, or is it something that you are working alongside of?
No, so it started in 2021. It was founded by Andy Roth, who's the president of our company, and he worked at the Club for Growth before founding the Freedom Caucus. And it was founded by him and Justin Ouimet, who was the executive director of the House Freedom Caucus for a very long time. Okay. So they founded it in 2021. Georgia was the first Freedom Caucus that they launched. And I joined on a month and a half ago as the communications director. And so the biggest thing that I've been trying to do as comms director is just getting more Republicans to pay attention to this. Like, look, take the school boards. We've been talking about that. Why did we start paying attention to school boards so much, kind of after COVID was coming to a close? The reason is because for the first time, we actually started paying attention to all this crap that was happening in schools, because all your kids were home on Skype or Zoom to see what was happening. The same thing needs to happen with state legislatures. Conservatives need to start paying attention to how terrible the Republicans are in their state legislatures. We're simply not doing that. We focus on Congress all the time, which is important. Like, it's all important stuff, but if the federal government eventually becomes beyond saving, it becomes way too nuts that you just can't vote your way out of it. The only solution we now have is building robust red state leadership. And we don't have that right now. We don't. You can go red state by red state by red state. It's all crap. It's all terrible. Like, did you know that? Here's another one. In Louisiana, the Speaker of the Louisiana House of Representatives got elected with more Democratic votes than Republicans, and he's a moderate rhino squish.
What?
Like, see, people just don't know these. Like, I didn't know these things until I started working here. And like, that's the biggest thing that I want to do as comms director, is just get conservatives on a much more prominent basis to pay attention to state and local politics, because that's what's going to save our country. Like, there's gridlock. Gridlock will happen forever in DC. Like, if we take back the White House in 2024, what are we going to be able to do in 4 years if we don't have the votes to do it in the House and Senate? Not a lot. We have to take advantage of the places where we do have the votes to do this, which is in red states. And we're not doing it right now because of how terrible GOP leadership is. And that is what I want to change and what I want to get conservatives to pay more attention to.
Wow. Okay. That's a great goal. And I really appreciate that for sure. Why do you think we've made it to this point without people paying really any attention to what's going on in their own states? Like, that surprises me on some level.
It's the same thing with school boards. I think it falls on two legs, which is just that the media doesn't really cover state and like national media doesn't really cover state and local politics as much as they do what happens in Washington, D.C. That's a big reason. Another big reason is because I just think people assume that if they live in a very red area, that the people that they are voting for, their Republicans that they vote for, are governing conservative and representing them in the way that is reflective of their values. And I think it's something that conservatives also assumed with school boards, which is like, I live in, suburban Texas and all of my neighbors are Republicans. My school board's probably fine. There's probably no porn in my school's library. I live in a red area. But then that's the simple problem is we were just not paying attention to it. And so everybody needs to know who your state rep and state senator are. You need to know who your school board members are. You need to know who your county commissioners are. You need to know who all of these people are, and you need to hold them accountable when they're not governing in the way that they should. The voters have to do that. Like, a lot of these people have been in office. A lot of these terrible Republicans, a lot of these terrible leaders in these state legislatures have been in office for years and years and years and years because, all of their constituents simply know who they are, know they're a Republican, and just vote for them and never really check their voting records. They really don't. And that's a problem. And it's a problem that really needs to change. That's one of the big reasons that you constantly have terrible red state leadership. Another reason is a big reason is just because of how the primary systems are set up in a lot of these states. So going back to Louisiana has jungle primaries like they have in California and Washington in a red state. Basically, what that means is the top two vote getters in the primary face off against each other in the general, regardless of party affiliation. And so what ends up happening is it's usually two Republicans and a lot of moderates get elected over people who are more conservative. And that's a big reason. Another reason is because states like Wyoming and states like Utah have open primaries. And what that means is anybody can vote in any primary, regardless of how they are registered. And what it leads to Democrats meddling in a lot of these primaries in order to elect more liberal Republicans. And that's what a lot of these people are doing. When you live in a red state where everyone's a registered Republican, you have to run as a Republican in order to have a chance of winning. And so a lot of people who would otherwise be Democrats are now running as Republicans. That's a big reason it's happening too. And again, we need to pay attention to this, and especially if you live in a red state.
I think that's a great point. Now, that's exactly what I was observing in West Virginia, was that these people were very, they were just kind of complacent. They were like, we are a red state. All our neighbors are Republicans. We trust, for example, our school boards. And then they were running into actual communists in those positions. And they were like, how is this happening? But at the end of the day, with a school board, from my understanding, you don't have to have a party affiliation in any capacity on those school board elections. You just have to go in there and say the right things. And that sounds like that's what's happening with a lot of other positions as well. Or they're going in as Republicans and saying Republican things. And then once they get elected, they can do kind of whatever they want.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And like specifically on school boards, like school board elections, like I've been involved. I work on the 1776 Project PAC with Ryan Gerdusky, my friend, good guy. And it's a PAC that's focusing specifically on electing pro-parent and anti-CRT school board members. And so the biggest thing that he set out to change when he started that PAC is a big reason that all of these communist school board members and crazy ass people get elected in extremely red areas is because the elections always happen at very random times. So for example, like 2 weeks ago on a random Tuesday in April, Wisconsin and Illinois had school board elections. Like not everybody knows that there's an election happening that day. The only people who do are, are people who are involved with the teachers unions and all of the special interests that have spent years, taking over these school boards. That's the big reason why all of these terrible school board members get get elected. And so the PAC has set out to change that, which is like, hey, informing people, you have a school board election today, elect somebody who will support parents' rights and will get porn out of libraries and get CRT out of the classrooms. That was the biggest thing that needed to change, and the PAC has been very successful in doing that.
That's fantastic to hear. There's just so much good news coming from you. I really appreciate it for sure, because we're always looking for silver linings over here. We really want to try to white pill people and kind of prevent them from. Yeah, go on.
Well, yeah, being constantly focused on federal government is just a major black pill, because nothing ever freaking happens. And when things do happen, the biggest things that do happen are horrible bipartisan monstrosities that make everything worse.
Right.
And so, like, if you only follow the federal government, you will be blackpilled for the rest of your life. The real place to make change is on the state and local levels, specifically with school boards and in state legislatures. And that's why I enjoy doing this, because you actually have the ability to win, whereas opposed to DC, where everything is gridlocked 100% of the time.
Right. Right. That's a great point. And I make that point too. I say it's a little bit like trying to fight climate change, where you look at the huge problem that affects the entire world and you're just like, oh my gosh, this is too much. I don't know what to do about it. Some people choose not to have kids. Some people, make very unfortunate life decisions as a result. I say, don't look at the federal government. Look at your lower level. Go to your school boards. Go and run for your city council. See what your mayor is up to and talk to the people in your own location. It's a step up from taking care of your own family and going to your own church, is looking at your immediate surroundings and trying to make that positive difference there. It's something that everyone can do. They just don't know how to. So it sounds like you guys are really educating people in how to get involved with that and getting people who are in office to actually take steps to hold people accountable. Do you have instructional stuff for people who want to get involved in their surrounding community? Is that like the next step down that you guys are thinking about doing, or is there anything like that in the works?
Well, I mean, with the Freedom Caucus Network, we're focused specifically on building the infrastructure for members who are already elected in order to build and maintain a Freedom Caucus. Obviously, it involves a lot of involvement with the local communities that these people represent. Obviously, we a big part of what we do is help them reach out to their constituents and get them to support the Freedom Caucus. We had one person tell us that one of his Republican colleagues, who's not in the Freedom Caucus yet, was walking into a grocery store or whatever, and somebody came up to him and asked why he hadn't joined the Freedom Caucus. I think this happened in South Carolina. That's the kind of stuff that we're trying to do, which is get people to understand that the Freedom Caucus are the only people that are actually fighting for you. The other people are beholden to the lobbyists and the special interests in their respective state capitals, or are just liberals pretending to be Republicans. That's a big thing. Obviously, with what Ryan does with the PAC is Ryan and Aiden Buzzetti, who are the two guys who run it, they obviously work directly hands-on with, just ordinary people who are angry about what's happening in schools and want to run for school boards. So they work directly with them and provide them the resources they need to run good campaigns, send mailers and whatnot. And, that's all, obviously they're a lot more hands-on with actual people in the communities than I am over at the Freedom Caucus. But, it still goes hand in hand.
Absolutely.
Since it's local politics.
Okay, so you have your Freedom Caucus thing, and then you have the 1776 PAC, which is Ryan Gerdusky's kind of co-project. That sounds great, because then you have the personal level with people in their immediate environments and how they can get involved with school boards and stuff. And then you have the actual elected officials kind of holding people accountable. Now, I love this idea because it, to me, sounds like that's a good way to hold Republican governors accountable. Is this something you've seen? Have you seen a change in the way governors run business because of the Freedom Caucuses at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Christy Gnome would have 100% signed the CBDC bill if the Freedom Caucus hadn't been so loud about opposing it. We had in, I believe, Montana. I'm trying to remember what this bill was. There was a bill that, a common sense conservative bill. I can't remember specifically off the top of my head, that the governor, Brad Little, refused to sign, but instead allowed to become law without his signature.
Interesting.
But he otherwise probably would have vetoed it if I forget, again, I'm trying to remember what the bill was. But he probably would have vetoed it if it weren't for how loud the Freedom Caucus was in supporting it. And there's a lot of these things are happening in you know, a lot of different states, like similar things like that, where, you know, because of how effective the Freedom Caucuses are, it's forcing governors to, you know, actually govern more conservative. You know, especially in a state like South Dakota, where Christy Gnome, as we know, had the whole NCAA escapade and all that other stuff.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah.
And like South Carolina too, like Henry McMaster is actually like an okay governor. He supported Donald Trump in 2016 before it was cool, and he's actually fairly conservative, but still still signs all of the terrible bills that GOP leadership in South Carolina sends his way. But you know, as the Freedom Caucus grows, I'm sure it will affect that as well. And obviously, like Georgia, obviously we know Brian Kemp's like pretty conservative. He signs most of the stuff that comes his way. But yeah, it is having an effect on that for sure.
That's great. And that does make sense because the people who are sending him these bills are going to be people who are then affected by the Freedom Caucus, which I think is great. Now, I do remember Christy Gnome's numerous missteps. I remember being really frustrated with her. People are like, oh, she's great. You know, she should run for president or whatever. And I'm like, I don't think a squish should run for any major office, honestly. I think you actually need a rock-ribbed conservative to say, no, we're not going to do whatever the left wing, or not even, it turns out, not even the left wing, right-leaning, supposedly members of your own party who are saying we're going to do this crazy, ludicrous thing because they're, you know, in enthralled to maybe the teachers' unions or whatever kind of special interest is coming their way. So that is overall still great news. I think that there are really great opportunities for all of this stuff. It's so good to see a practical application of how we actually make this happen. So I know I'm kind of wanting to shift gears here a little bit and just get your take on the Anheuser-Busch controversy, because I saw you retweeted something from Michael Seifert, who is the founder, CEO of Public Square, which is a great app that makes it possible for people to support companies that support their own values. Talking about if you're sick of being lectured by companies you shop from and are tired of woke ideology being shoved down your throat, remember you have the power in your wallet. I think that's a great point. So what do you think about what went down with Anheuser-Busch, and what do you think of Donald Trump Jr. saying to pull back on a boycott from them because they're getting the GOP, and specifically I think probably his dad's campaign, are getting money from these people? That to me seems like such a clear conflict of interest.
Well, no, I think the boycott showed that, as Michael talks about all the time, when people actually make a concerted effort to deny their dollars to companies that hate them, it can have a very profound impact. And like, you know, we saw there's Anheuser-Busch's stock drop, you know, I think $6 billion in market capitalization when this began. Like, this is the power that you have simply just with your wallet. Like, something Michael talks about all the time is like the biggest way you can change America is by simply stop going to Starbucks and go to the local coffee shop in your community that is on the Public Square app. That's something Michael says all the time, and it's 100% true. Like, you know, you can complain about what these woke corporations do. It's another thing to actually make an effort to find alternatives and support local businesses, which you should be supporting local business
Right.
anyway, because that's very important. But businesses that also share your values. Like, you know, my favorite beer is Yingling, because I grew up in the Philadelphia area, and which is where Yingling is from. And it's, you know, a great beer. And they dropped this pro-America tweet that went really viral, like, as this was happening.
Right.
And so stop drinking Bud Light and drink Yingling. You know, Coors Light, you know, the former president of Coors Light was a founding member of the Heritage Foundation. Like, support these companies that actually do not hate you and aren't going to force gender ideology down your throat, instead of, you know, buying a Bud Light or a Budweiser, which is piss water anyway.
Yeah, that's fair.
In terms of Donald Trump Jr., you know, money in politics is money in politics.
Yeah.
It's a reality of politics. Like, he got a lot of crap for that, but again, it's a reality of politics, which is that, you know, money makes the whole engine move forward. So obviously I disagree with him, but I'm not going to give him too much crap for that. Like, if he had actually said, like, you know, if he just said, I think boycotts are dumb in general, then I would have had a bigger problem with it. But like, again, I disagree with him, but I'm not going to give him too much crap for that.
Okay. I do think that's fair analysis, considering that I believe in the same sentence he also said, they are better about donating to the GOP than they are to the Democrat Party. I'm like, okay, that might actually be full disclosure, because you're saying don't boycott them because they support our party. Fine, whatever. People are definitely going to disagree with you on that one, because people, I think, finally feel like they can actually make a difference in this kind of culture war. So I don't think they're going to let up on this boycott of Anheuser-Busch. And I constantly am saying, I'm so sorry that I can't assist in this boycott, because I never drank Bud or Bud Light in the first place, because it's really gross. It looks disgusting. And people constantly are saying, like, I don't want to drink something that looks the same going in as it does coming out. And I'm like, I think that's really fair too. I think that that's a disgusting product. But as far as quality goes, I think that the thread that I'm seeing through all of this stuff, from the Freedom Caucuses to the 1776 Project to actually maintaining a true boycott, is that it requires a lot of work. Now, we know there is a quote that is of spurious source. No one really knows where it came from, but I think of it often, and that is that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And I think that's completely correct. I think that's what we're looking at here. I constantly talk about how we live in kind of this interesting time in history where everything's easier than it ever has been before. And I'm not just talking about technology. I'm talking about going to the store and getting whatever we need at the drop of a hat. I'm talking about being able to go to the doctor whenever we need. Maybe part of that is turning on the TV and seeing whatever we want to see at the time. But at the same time, it's like that puts us into this false sense that everything's going to come easy for us. And that's a dangerous place to be, especially when we have things as important as liberty to fight for. So how do we kind of change people's minds? How do we make this cultural change? How do we kind of get it into the individual psyche to say we are going to have to work hard, times are going to be hard, we're going to have to change our expectations? Is there a good overarching way to kind of convey that message to more people at once?
Yeah, I mean, it's just keep being loud about all of these issues is a big one. We have the cool, like the great thing is we have social media to convey this message. And if you have a Twitter account these days, the power that you have with your phone rivals that of the largest journalistic institutions in America, which is why they're so mad when Elon bought the platform. It's just it's pretty much everything we've been talking about, which is just like be loud on the issues, speak up if you have the means to speak up. Buy from a local clothing store that is on public square instead of going to Walmart or Target or something like that. Run for school board, run for county commissioner, get involved in your local GOP, get involved in your local community and to affect change that way. Like all of these things have a place in this, and it's not. I wouldn't even call it like hard work. It's all just shifting attention away from something that like focusing too much on DC which will never change, versus focusing on things in your local community that actually have the means to change. I think that's a big way we do it. I think, and obviously continuing to to effectively communicate a culture war, to be culture warriors in the GOP, to talk about all these winning issues in effective ways. Like all of these things are a part of that. And I think if we do that, then there's a lot to be hopeful for the future.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you're completely correct. Now, I'm an avid student of Stoicism, which heavily encourages people to focus only on the things that are in their control. And this is part of the reason I encourage people not to pay too much attention to the federal government, other than doing their due diligence, going out and voting, maybe knocking on doors for specific candidates for their state or whatever. But at the end of the day, there's a very small set of things that you can actually control. And that means things like your family. That means things like maybe your local school board, going to meetings and raising heck when it comes to it. Like that dad who went, dressed in armor. I forget what his point was, but he was making a good, strong point about the school board not paying attention to parents and not caring about what was in like their school library. But you have to take that step and actually do the work yourself, which I think people have kind of shied away from. Do you think it's been I'm gonna kind of diverge a little bit here and ask you, do you think it's been harmful for our culture to say, you know what, don't talk about, religion and politics in public. Don't discuss any of that stuff. It's just not polite. Do you think that's been bad for us?
Yeah, I think refusing to engage on a lot of these cultural issues is something that has hurt the GOP for many, many years. And I think they're the biggest problem. Like if I had to identify the biggest problem with the Republican Party today, it's that our national apparatus, and specifically the biggest donors to our party, are are too afraid of being called racist or sexist. It's sexist. They're more afraid of being called a racist than anything else. And that's the biggest thing that I think hurts us, because it leads us to do insanely unproductive things, like completely ignore all of these cultural issues that we're going to be called racist for,
right?
In fear of the label. I think has been a huge problem. I think that, and I think, for a long time, the GOP was the party of big business and was the party of corporate America, obviously, and of the military industrial complex. And that has kind of reversed itself, especially maybe not with all of the GOP members in DC, but certainly with the Republican base. And I think just, we've refused to engage on issues of culture that are winning issues. Like Glenn Youngkin did that effectively, and he flipped Virginia, which voted Biden by 10 points the year prior. Like these are all like winning issues that our main party apparatus is like still busy talking about how Democrats are the real racists, then they are actually engaging with voters in this way that is very effective to them. And I think the moment we decide to change that is a time that the Republican Party will start to be more successful broadly in elections.
I think you're entirely correct. And I have been harping on about this because I personally think that the message that conservatism has to send to young people is incredibly appealing. Like, you can be responsible for yourself, which means you can do with your life what you want to. You can go find your own partner, and you should. You should build your own family. That's very important. You should, follow your religion, and you should go out of your way to make yourself as rich as possible to be. So this caters directly to human nature, and this caters to the desires of a lot of young people. But for some reason, we have been saddled with this party that is unable to communicate these ideas in any meaningful way, to the point where kids are like, I won't be a Republican. That's boring and dumb. And they're all fuddy-duddies and stodgy. And I'm like, we're missing something here. We should be appealing to these people. What do you think the GOP can do to appeal to young people more?
The biggest thing they could do right now is actually start using TikTok. That's going to be controversial, probably. That's probably controversial to say. Start using it would take me forever. My very controversial take at the moment is I oppose banning TikTok.
Interesting.
I oppose banning it. I started using it like a couple months ago. I've gained a lot of followers on it. And, you look at your analytics, and the average person on TikTok that follows me is between 18 and 24 years old. This is the app that Generation Z is using in order to invest in news and to communicate. And I'm sure you saw that Axios story the other day about how Biden is employing all of these various influencers, many of whom are on TikTok, to push him before 2024. And people made fun of it because it's cringe, but it's effective. This is the app all of these people are using, and we are completely ignoring it. And as a result, they're only seeing one side of the story. And what's happening? Well, we lost Gen Z voters by almost 30 points in 2022. We need to do that. I think that's something we need to do. I think the push to ban TikTok is insanely misguided for many, many different reasons. I can explain them if you want me to and see what you think about it, but it's a pretty long story. But that's one thing. The second thing is we are not driving out young voters in the same way that the Democrat Party is. If you go to any college campus, take the Wisconsin election that just happened. You had Democratic Party officials on campuses at colleges registering kids to vote and ensuring that they vote. The polling places are all at these universities. And we have no turnout machine like that happening within the national GOP. And it's a complete joke. And it needs to happen. It does. That's another thing too. And again, I think like we were talking about earlier, there are ways to communicate to Gen Z that are highly effective. And I've kind of learned a lot about this by being on TikTok for the last couple months. Like, say to a young kid, hey, vote for Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis, whoever the nominee is. You will probably not get drafted into World War III because both of those guys want to end the war instead of keep continuing to fund it. Like, things like that are just incredibly simple messages that you can give to Gen Z that Republicans are just not doing. Like our attempts to reach out to Gen Z are like, they range from a complete joke to just downright pathetic. And I've tried to change. Like, I'm trying to change that by just putting out our message on this app that pretty much every kid under the age of 25 in America is using day in and day out. You can make fun of me for it, but it's true.
No, I'm not going to make fun of you for that, because that's a really interesting idea and not one I'd considered before. I always welcome those kinds of ideas, but I do think that's a good point, because the issue is that we're not finding the avenue to directly connect with them. So it almost doesn't matter how good our ideas actually are. If no one is, for example, on TikTok talking about this stuff, then they're not going to know about it, right? So you could get people pushing the idea of, hey, you know what you actually want? You want a generation of kids who think kind of like you, who are interested in having families. You want a generation of women, for example, who are not interested in hookup culture. You want a generation of men who aren't addicted to horrible things online. And you want to make sure that you're kind of vibing with these people on a values level. I think that would go over incredibly well with Gen Z, because I feel like they especially are looking at our current situation, and it has to be depressing. I had a dream. I was talking about this on Twitter and on my Instagram the other day, and the response from conservatives was exactly what I expected. But I had a dream. I went back to the apartment that I rented when I was 21, 22, $425 a month for a 1-bedroom in a decent part of the town that was close to both of my jobs at the time, close to shopping, close to the church that I was going to at the time. I looked up the same apartment and it's the same dimensions in the same town, and it's now 3, 4, 5 times as expensive. And I said, you guys, we need to consider that things are difficult for young people out there today. And we can't just say things we've always said that have never really worked, that especially don't work now, like pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Because if things had been as expensive today as they were when I left home, I would never have left home. And this is something you see with a lot of young people. They're stuck at home, and that has to be frustrating. It really has to be. And this is part of the reason they're saying things like, we need student loan debt forgiven. Right? Because they feel trapped. They feel stuck at home. They feel like they're never going to be able to get out. We have to break through and change the messaging on that.
Yeah, you're exactly correct. Our messaging can't just be socialism sucks or whatever. And I don't even have I like Charlie Kirk. I think he's a great person, but you can't just yell that at people and expect them to vote for you. You have to consider why socialism may be attractive to a person who has, grown up, with the great, who came of age, as we were coming out of the Great Recession, and then took on a lot of debt to go to get a college degree that is now paying them a wage that their starting wage is less than the debt that they owe. That's, you have to speak to, in order to win Gen Z, you have to speak to the issues that Gen Z actually cares about and fight back against, the propaganda that is being thrown their way by the left on issues such as with the Second Amendment. You have to actually speak to issues and actually engage with these people who are saying, hey, we want to be engaged with, and only one political party is currently doing that in any major way, and it's not the Republican Party.
Right.
It has to be done. A perfect issue that could be incredibly beneficial to both the country and appeal to Generation Z is seize the endowments.
Right.
Just go after college endowments and use that and take their endowments and make colleges liable for the debts that they've put on these kids. And are any Republicans doing that right now? Only Josh Hawley is. He actually introduced a bill to go after the endowments. Thank God we have Josh Hawley. But
right.
You look at like our leaders in the Senate are Mitch McConnell, John Cornyn, John Thune, Barrasso. Like, who the hell is looking at these guys and being like, yes, those guys get me very excited to vote for this party? Like, the answer to that question is no. Like,
Right.
the only people actually introducing game-changing legislation in Congress that would actually appeal to a wide variety of people are populist Republicans like Josh Hawley, like J.D. Vance. Like, those are the types of people that we need to elect more of, I think. Absolutely. Because, like, those are the people that actually, I think, can reach out just on a pure policy level, reach out to Gen Z. The other thing is, like, a big reason Gen Z is voting overwhelmingly for Democrats is because Democrats are very good at getting you emotionally invested in their cause in a way that Republicans are not. Like, you look at, the messaging that some of these quote unquote influencers the Biden admin is using to push themselves onto Gen Z, and like, they're cringe and terrible and they make you like they're stupid, but they're very good at appealing to you on an emotional level. And that's something more than anything that Republicans have failed to do and need to change. And it's not hard to change that. It's not hard to tweak your messaging in order to appeal to the emotions of people. It's just a question of if we're going to do it. And we have to.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, now that you mentioned Josh Hawley, that makes me think that the people in the Republican Party that I could envision using something like, not necessarily TikTok, but something like TikTok, are people who are under 40 years old or right thereabouts. People like Josh Hawley, people like Rand Paul's a little bit older than that, but people in that kind of age range who are also in tune with conservatism as we actually believe it should be. People like J.D. Vance, people closer to like Joe Kent up in Washington, even though he didn't win his election. Those people, I think, actually are the future of the GOP. And you mentioned the emotions, and I'll wrap up after this because we've gone a little bit long, but I think it's interesting you mentioned that, because what I'm constantly begging people for, the people who follow me, the people who argue with me, when I simply observe that the apartment I used to rent in 2011, 2012 is now 3 to 5 times as expensive as it was, what they'll say is move out of the city and don't engage with nightlife. I had 3 jobs when I was 21 to 22 years old, and I was going to community college. I was not involved in nightlife. I made $17,000 a year. It was barely enough to survive, but because rent was only $425, I was able to live independently of like my parents. I was able to move out of the basement, which was fantastic for me. It was very formative for me. It was very important to me personally. I'd be able to do that. So when I tell conservatives about this, they say things like, be better with your money. And I say, you know what? This is entirely the wrong approach. This isn't going to work. What you need when you're talking to young people with reason and with logic is compassion. So the person who can mix those two things properly is going to be the real winner, and they are going to persuade the next generation. And I see people like Josh Hawley who work on that. I see people who are younger working on that. I see people like Lauren Chen and some of these young alt media commentators who are really kind of engaging with that idea, which is very rewarding to see. But you're right. The Democrats are much better with engaging with that emotion. But at the end of the day, I think it comes down to how conservatives view humanity. Like, you need to be compassionate to people, and not even just to get your message through, right? You need to be compassionate to people because they're fellow human beings. Like, we are pro-life. We don't like abortion. And that means that we should care about people once they grow up, even if they make terrible mistakes, even if, for example, they get a gender reassignment. We should still be saying, you know what? I'm very sorry that happened. I'm very sorry you now feel like you made a terrible mistake. Here's what we're going to try to do to help you fix it, right? Instead of just saying tribalism, you're wrong. You were wrong about that. Look at that. Look how wrong you are now. Look how miserable you are. And this is kind of what I see from more the Republican Party. There are people who are more independent who are kind of pushing back on that. So that's a real relief. But at the same time, yeah, I think we need to push that message of compassion, since we do want people to be around and since we want people to succeed. Greg.
I wouldn't even like call it compassion. I would just say, like, push an agenda that people actually believe in and can get behind and actually can improve their life in a major way, instead of just saying, no, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, blah, 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 blah. That's how I would say it. I wouldn't even like say it, like, obviously be compassionate, but like, I would just say, like, actually push a popular agenda instead of a really dumb one.
Right, exactly.
That doesn't appeal to anybody.
Right, and what I'm saying is that these conservative values actually are very popular, but they have to be couched in terminology that is very sympathetic, empathetic, understanding, and compassionate. So there would be like this underlayment of compassion, and on it you can put all of these popular actual conservative ideas. And I love your idea about TikTok. I wish that it weren't Chinese spyware. I really wish it weren't on everyone's phones. But I think that if we want to try to weaponize that in the culture war, I think that would be a great step forward. So hopefully you have success pushing that idea. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think we'll wrap it here. Where can people find you online?
You can follow me on Twitter, Greg_Price11, which is also my TikTok and my Instagram. And then follow my Substack. I'm starting to do a lot more actual reporting, like original reporting on my Substack page. And so that's, a lot of good stuff coming on that end too. And check out the Freedom Caucus Network as well. And ask your state rep and state senator why they haven't joined the Freedom Caucus yet. Thank you so much for having me. It was great to be on with you.
Yeah, no problem. So does the Freedom Caucus have a Twitter account?
Yeah, it's SCF _ network.
SCF.
So SFC _ network, State Freedom Caucus Network.
State Freedom. Okay, I'm going to put that in the description too, because that's going to be really important. Yes, SFC _ network. Perfect. Okay, cool. Greg, thanks so much for all your great ideas. I'm really looking forward to all your independent journalism. Talking to you has been such a white pill, and I'm really excited to share this with the audience this evening at 7. And to my audience, as always, thank you again for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow. Until then, bye guys. How's it going?